KP's Video News. It's KP's Video News, y'all. It's KP's Video News, y'all.
That's right. It's KP's Video News, y'all. And as you know, as this world progresses and we go through the things that we do on a daily basis, and we're trying to make ends, and we're trying to make progress in this ever and never-ending struggle for racial equality, we really need to be trying to think of like racial self-sufficiency. Basically, that would be more my concern, because I don't really want to be like those oppressors. I don't want to be like those oppressors. So that means if I want to try to be like equal to you, that means I would be an oppressor. So I don't want to be that. I want to be better than that. So I'm more or less trying to seek my own independent way of life, separate from you, in the sense that not like I'm a separatist or on that level where you got to be over there and I got to be over here. In other words, I want to build up my people to where we can be self-sufficient without relying on anyone. And so this conversation has come up, and it has come up again and again. And so now the new conversation is, after the civil rights era, white Americans failed to support a systematic change to end racism. And now the question is, what are they going to do now? So the first wave, Black Lives Matter movement, which crested after the 2014 police killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, had the support of less than half of white Americans. And given that Americans tend to have a very narrow definition of racism, many at the time were likely confused by the juxtaposition that of black-led protests, implying that racism was persistent alongside the presence of a black family in the White House. Barack Obama's presidency was seen as evidence that racism was in a decline. Not true. The current second wave of the movement feels different, in part because of the past months, protests have been multiracial, and the media and scholars have noted that whites' sensibilities have become more attuned to the issues of anti-black police violence and discrimination. After the first wave of the movement in 2014, there was little systematic change in response to demands of Black Lives Matter activists. Does the fact that whites are participating in the current protests in greater numbers mean that the outcome of these protests will be different? Will whites go beyond participating in marches and actually support fundamental policy changes that fight anti-black violence and discrimination? And as a scholar of political science and African American studies, I believe there are lessons from the civil rights movement 60 years ago that can help answer those questions. And the principles didn't turn into policy. And the challenges that black Americans face today do not precisely mimic those of the 1960s, but the history is still relevant. During the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century, there was a concerted effort among black freedom fighters to show white Americans the kind of racial terrorism the average black American lived under on a day-by-day basis. Through the power of television, whites were able to see with their own eyes how respectable, nonviolent black youths were treated by police as they sought to push the U.S. to give up to its creed of liberty and equality for all of its citizens. Monumental legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed, purportedly guaranteeing protection from racial discrimination in many public spaces and an equal opportunity to register to vote and cast a ballot. Additionally, whites were increasingly likely to report attitudes that many would now view as non-racist over the following several decades. For example, white Americans were more willing to have a non-white neighbor. they were less likely to support ideas of biological racism or the idea that whites should always have access to better jobs over blacks. But these changed values and attitudes among whites never fully translated into support for government policies that would bring racial equality to fruition for black people. White Americans remain uncommitted to the integrating public schools, which has been shown so drastically reduce the so-called racial achievement gap. Whites never gave more than a mediocre support for affirmative action policies aimed at the level playing field for jobs and higher education. And this phenomenon, the distance between what people say they value and what they're willing to do or live up to their ideals, is a common that social scientists have given its name the principal policy gap. White Americans' direct witness of police brutality led to a shift in racial attitudes and the passage of significant legislation, but even these combined changes did not radically change the face of racial inequality of American society. And going backwards, by the 1970s and 80s, political leaders would capitalize on white sentiments that efforts for racial equality had gone too far. That created an environment that allowed the retrenchment of the civil rights era gains. The Republican Party's so-called Southern strategy, which aimed to turn white Southern Democrats into Republican voters, was successful in consolidating the support of white Southerners through the use of racial dog whistles, and the war on drugs was served to disproportionately target and police already segregated black communities. By the 1990s, racial disparities in incarceration rates had skyrocketed. Schools began to resegregate, and federal and state policies that created residential segregation and the existing racial wealth gap were never adequately addressed. And scholars have made efforts to reveal the intricate and structural nature of racism in the United States. Their analysis range from showing how racial disparities across various domains of American life are intricately connected rather than coincidentally, to highlight the ways in which race-neutral policies like the GI Bill helped to set the stage for today's racial wealth gap, to explanation that America's racial hierarchy is the caste system, and it's a caste system. But our research shows that white Americans, including white millennials, have largely become accustomed to thinking about racism in terms of overall racial prejudice, discrimination, and bigotry. They don't see the deeper, more intractable problems that scholars and black activists have laid out. Consequently, it has taken a filmed incident of incendiary racism to awaken whites to the problem clearly identified by black activists, just as it did for previous generations. And attitudes and policies don't match. Some have suggested that this second wave of Black Lives Matter movement is the largest social movement in American history, and these protests have led local representatives to publicly proclaim that Black Lives Matter, policymakers, government officials, and corporations to decry and remove Confederate symbols and racist images, and congressional as well as local attempts to address police accountability. But after the civil rights era, the principal policy gap seems to be reappearing. Attitudes among whites are changing, but the policies that people are willing to support do not necessarily address the more complex issue of structural racism. For example, polling reveals that people support both these protests and the way the police are handling them, despite the evidence of ongoing brutality. The polling also shows that the majority of Americans believe that police are more likely to use deadly force against black Americans than against whites, but only 1/4 of those polling are willing to support efforts to reduce funding the police, a policy aimed to distribute funds to support community equity. More whites are willing to acknowledge white racial privilege, but only about 1/8 support reparations, for blacks. Americans may choose to dig deeper this time around. Some state legislatures, for example, are attempting to leverage this moment to create more systematic changes beyond policing in schools, judicial systems, and health matters. But ultimately, Americans will have to overcome two intertwined challenges. First, they have to learn to detect forms of racism that don't lend themselves to a mobile phone filming, and they have to recognize that dismantling centuries of oppression takes more than acknowledgement, understanding, and well-meaning sentiment. It takes sacrifice and it takes action. Gotta have action involved, a lot of action. And it's really, really bad. Then this story here, you got a lot of things going on, and this is something else that a lot of people are not. I'm talking about that systematic racism, but this is something that pertaining to environmental racism in the United States, and 10 alarming examples of environmental racism in the United States, and communities of color in the United States are often victims of environmental racism, which describes the disproportionate impact on their lives because of living near hazardous pollution. Numerous studies have shown that black and Hispanic communities are exposed to higher proportions of air pollution, toxic waste sites, landfills, lead poisoning, and other industrial complexes compared to their white counterparts. For example, that Michigan, this thing that happened up there in Flint, Michigan, with the water, where the people in that city decided they would reverse and take the water that they were sending to the GM plant in Michigan. They started sending that water to the people, and they started sending the good, clean, fresh water to the GM plant. And the results of thousands of people being exposed to lead in their water, and they could care less what they were doing. And right to this day, that problem still has not been solved. And it's been like 3 years later. An estimated 70% of contaminated waste sites are located in low-income neighborhoods, and upwards of 2 million Americans live within a mile of a site that is vulnerable to flooding, the majority of which are in black and brown communities. The list goes on and on, but here are a few of the many alarming examples of the environmental racism across the country. And it's like, the environmental justice movement, which began in the 1960s when people of color began pushing back against the disproportionate level of exposure to hazardous waste, air pollutants, and chemicals. Half a century later, the issue still persists across the country, and today people of color are more likely to live in areas with higher rates of air pollution, toxic waste facilities, landfills, and lead poisoning. And the studies have shown that non-Hispanic whites have the lowest exposure rates to air pollution as opposed to Hispanic and black Americans, and that over half of the people who live in close proximity to toxic waste facilities are people of color. In a 2018 study conducted by the EPA showed that at the national, state, and county levels, non-white Americans are disproportionately burdened by particulate matter or air pollution consisting of automobile fumes, smog, soot, oil, smoke, ash, and construction dust than white people. This type of pollution has been named a definitive carcinogen by the International Agency and Research on Cancer, and has been declared by the EPA as a contributor to adverse health conditions, including lung issues, heart attacks, and premature death. Environmental racism can exist in many forms, and here, this is just some of the blatant examples of injustice. This type of environmental injustice across America. You have you got your factories and all that. You have your Cancer Alley in Louisiana. Cancer Alley is an 85-mile stretch along the Mississippi River between New Orleans and Baton Rouge that has been lined with oil refineries and petrochemical plants. And It's got a sinister name, Cancer Alley, because the residents of that area are 50 times more likely to develop cancer than the average American. And those that live there are predominantly black people and that live in that area. And that's wow, between New Orleans and then Pahokee, Florida, and then residents of the Glades in Pahokee, Florida have a harrowing reality. And every October, the arrival of black snow or a thick level of soot that pollutes the area due to sugar burning. And they're over there, sugar plantations over there burning sugar, and it comes back down as a form of black, they call it black snow. And Cheraw, South Carolina, up until 1970, cancer-causing PCBs were dumped in a creek by the Burlington Industries. Decades later, the effects are still being felt, even though they stopped. Those effects are still there right to this day. Uniontown, Alabama, in 2008, over 1 billion tons of deadly coal ash spilled into the Emory River and channel in Kingston, Tennessee, and the catastrophe left workers who cleaned the mess to suffer from brain cancer, lung cancer, and leukemia. And in 2010, the Tennessee Valley Authority transported 4 million cubic yards of coal ash from the spill into Uniontown, Alabama, a predominantly low-income black community, under the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability, and it deemed the coal ash non-hazardous in Uniontown, therefore provide the community with no protection against a highly dangerous substance. So they moved it from one spot to another spot that was a predominantly black area. And this is the one that's alarming. The Bronx, New York. The Bronx is among the most racially diverse boroughs in New York City, and it bears the burden of disproportionate level of pollution. Air pollution rates are so bad that in some neighborhoods an estimated 20% of the children have asthma. So the South Bronx has been nicknamed Asthma Alley. And then this one I was talking about earlier, the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, has been called one of the most egregious examples of environmental injustice. And the crisis occurred when the city failed to properly treat its municipal water system after changing water sources. And they changed that water source. They switched the water sources and sent the good clean water to the GM automotive plant and sent the bad water to the city of Flint. And those people got lead and everything else in that water. And right to this day, it's still having problems. Houston, Texas. So Houston, Texas, which is 98% Hispanic, has come to the concentrated region of oil refineries, chemical plants, sewage treatment facilities, and has hazardous waste sites. Each year, up to 484,000 pounds of toxic chemicals are released throughout the area from 21 surrounding toxic release inventory facilities. Wow, man, this is crazy, man. Crazy. LA, Los Angeles, California. Studies have shown that black, Latino, and low-income California residents are more likely to live near oil and gas wells that spew toxic pollution, and people of color are more likely to live among power plants, oil refineries, and landfills. Additionally, the Exide Technologies battery recycling plant in Vernon, California, closed down in 2015, but toxic levels of lead left in the wake of it still has not been cleaned up. And that's predominantly Latino neighborhood over there in that area. So it's like, got two more to go with. Warren County, North Carolina, after liquid contaminated with PCBs were dumped along 240 miles of road in 1978, affecting predominantly poor black communities. The state of North Carolina, who's Warren County, to house the toxic waste facility to help clean it up. But when the residents realized this would affect their health and drinking water, they fought back, holding protests and suing to stop the landfill from being placed there. And they ultimately lost the legal fight, and the toxic waste facility was moved there anyway. That's Warren County, North Carolina. They got a toxic waste dump in that area. It's a predominantly black area. And Detroit, most polluted zip code is 71% black, and the air pollution is so bad it can make the sky look like a fiery orange glare. The 250-acre tank Marathon Farm has expanded over the last several decades. It has achieved and received over 15 violations for surpassing federal and state emission guidelines from the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy in the past years. And as a reminder, I have to remind you all that Donald the DC Dunce Trump, that's the first thing that he did when he got in office, after lying about how many people he had at his inauguration compared to Barack Obama's. We all know Barack Obama had with so many people you couldn't even see the ground. But anyway, what he did was he reversed all the environmental protections. All the environmental protections that had been put in place, and especially the environmental protections that had been put in place by Barack Obama, he reversed them all. So therefore, he made it legal for all of these factories to spew out all this dirt and soot and pollution and toxic waste. He made it okay for them to start doing that, dumping all this garbage all over again. And so this is what we're dealing with, folks. This is what we're dealing with here in this country. And now November's coming up really soon. Really soon. It's coming up soon, folks. We got about 2 months, 2.5 months left. We got September, October. We got about 2.5 months left before it's time to vote. Get out there and vote. If you're not registered to vote, register as soon as possible. Take your grandmother, take your auntie, take your kids that are 18 and up. Take your kids over there. Go to the DMV. If you don't get anything else, get a ID card. Get registered to vote. Go online. You can register online in a lot of cities. Go get on your computer, on your tablet, on your phone. I know everybody got a phone. Find your city, local cities website. Go to that website, local county register's website, and register to vote. You got to do it today. Do it as soon as possible, because you cannot wait to the last second to talk about registering to vote. Oh yeah, also, if you're going to be voting by mail, as soon as you get that ballot, fill it out, send it back the same day. Make sure you sign it. First thing you do is sign it first, so you won't forget. Sign it. Sign your mail-in ballot first, so you won't forget. Look closely at the ballot, because it might say that you might need to put a stamp on it. And do what you have to do to get out. Vote. You got to vote. We got to get this DC Dunce has got to go, with all the hate and the racism and all the pollution and the environmental things that he's done. All the people that have lost their lives, over 160,000 people dead, over 5 million people infected with the coronavirus, because he sat on his lazy ass and didn't do a thing to shut the country down when he should have. And he still hasn't done anything. Still, they want to require people to wear masks. So we have to do what we got to do to survive. Social distancing, wearing your mask. Put your mask on. Got to put your mask on. Do what you got to do, folks. You got to survive. You have to protect yourself. You cannot depend on this government to protect you. You have to protect yourself when it comes to dealing with this coronavirus, as we can see. So do what you got to do. Take care of your family.
KP Video News.
Vote.
It's KP's Video News, yo.
That's right, folks.
It's
KP's Video News.
Yo.